What's up, world history? We're back talking about World War One. Yesterday, we made it up to the point where the United States entered the war. Remember, up to that point, they we were involved financially. We're heavily involved financially, but we hadn't sent soldiers. So we have officially, at this point, joined the war effort. I'm going to X myself out here, and we're going to go through this PowerPoint. Probably won't finish it all, but this is a PowerPoint I use in my U.S. history class. So the purpose of us using this is the other PowerPoints were designed for world history. And this is a world history class, but since you guys will one day have to be taking a U.S. history EOC, we're going to look at this from a more Americentric, if that's a word, point of view. So let me go ahead and X myself out, and we will get going. Talks about new weaponry, right? Talked about the huge death toll, 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, and the Russo-Japanese Wars. If you added them all together, there would be less deaths than World War One. We spoke about the trenches and how that looked. This one right here, and we're going through these really fast, but Lusitania sunk. You guys know that was a big one, right? Here's some Russian women. Remember, Russia by this point had signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Not by this point, as in August 1914, but by the time the U.S. Really gets fully involved. So let's keep going. That guy Lenin overthrows the Russian monarch and establishes communism. At first, we're pretty happy about the overthrowing of the monarch, but then our politicians here in the States start to feel like maybe that's not such a good thing after all. All right, we did it. What was it that finally got us to start fighting German violations of free trade, specifically unrestricted submarine warfare? And I will exit this really quickly because I want to read a transcript of this address to Congress when the president was trying to ask for them to support the war effort. It's a little long, but we're going to go ahead and read it. So, gentlemen of the Congress, I've called the Congress into an extraordinary session because there are serious, very serious choices of policy that to be made, and made immediately, which it was neither right nor constitutionally permissible that I should assume the responsibility of making. On the 3rd February last, I officially laid before you the extraordinary announcement of the Imperial German government that on and after the first day of February, it was its purpose to put aside all restraints of law or humanity and use its submarines to sink every vessel that sought to approach either the ports of Great Britain and Ireland or the western coasts of Europe or any of the ports controlled by the enemies of Germany within the Mediterranean. Let's pause right there. Stopping trade, sinking ships trying to go to Great Britain and Western Europe, that may not have been intended primarily to punish the United States. But if the English can't, if they can't import things from the United States, that means we're not getting that money that we typically received from international trade. So, loss of life, of course, was a factor, but more than anything, it was this these violations of trade that had seemed to be the object of the German submarine warfare earlier in the war. But since April of last year, the imperial government had somewhat restrained the commanders of its undersea craft in conformity with its promise, then gave to us that passenger boats should not be sunk and that due warning would be given to all other vessels which its submarines might seek to destroy when no resistance was offered or escape attempted, and care taken that their crews were given at least a fair chance to save their lives in their open boats. These precautions taken were meager and haphazard enough, as was proved in distressing instance after instance in the progress of the cruel and unmanly business, but a certain degree of restraint was observed. The new policy has swept every restriction aside. Vessels of every kind, whatever their flag, their character, their cargo, their destination, their errand, have been ruthlessly sent to the bottom without warning and without thought of help or mercy for those on board, the vessels of friendly neutrals, along with those of belligerents. Even hospital ships and ships carrying relief to the sorely bereaved and stricken people of Belgium, through the latter, though the latter were provided with safe conduct through the proscribed areas by the German government itself and were distinguished by unmistakable marks of identity, have been sunk with the same reckless lack of compassion or of principle. I was for a little while unable to believe that such things would in fact be done by any government that had hitherto subscribed to the humane practices of civilized nations. International law had its origin in the attempt to set up some law which would be respected and observed upon the seas, where no nation had right of domination and where lay the free highways of the world. This minimum of right the German government has swept aside under the plea of retaliation and necessity, and because it had no weapons which it could use at sea except these which make it impossible to employ as it is employing them without throwing to the winds all scruples of humanity or of respect for the understandings that were supposed to underlie the intercourse of the world. I am not now thinking of the loss of property involved, immense and serious as it is, but only of the wanton and wholesale destruction of the lives of non combatants, men, women, and children engaged in pursuits which has always, even in the darkest periods of modern history, been deemed innocent and legitimate. Property can be paid for, the lives of peaceful and innocent people cannot be. The present German submarine warfare against commerce is a warfare against mankind. It is still a war against all nations. American ships have been sunk, American lives taken, in ways which it has stirred us very deeply to learn of. But the ships and people of other neutral and friendly nations have been sunk and overwhelmed in the waters in the same way. There has been no discrimination. The challenge is to all mankind. Each nation must decide for itself how it will meet it. The choice we make for ourselves must be made with a moderation of counsel and a temperateness of judgment befitting our character and our motives as a nation. We must put excited feeling away. Our motive will not be revenge or the victorious assertion of the physical might of the nation, but only the vindication of right, of human right, of which we are only a single champion. Again, to pause. What a beautiful sentence. It's inspiring to read a speech from a president that is this eloquent and thoughtful. Um, Wilson is really doing his very best to let people know this is why we have to do this. This is why we don't have a choice in declaring war. When I addressed the Congress on the 26th of February last, I thought that it would suffice to assert our neutral rights with arms, our right to use the seas against unlawful interference, our right to keep our people safe against unlawful violence. But armed neutrality, it now appears, is impracticable, because submarines are in effect outlaws when used as the German submarines have been used against merchant ships. It is impossible to defend ships against their attacks, as the law of nations has assumed that merchantmen would defend themselves against privateers or cruisers, visible craft giving chase upon the open sea. It is common prudence in such circumstances, grim necessity indeed, to endeavor to destroy them before they have shown their own intention. They must be dealt with upon sight, if dealt with at all. The German government denies the right of neutrals to use arms at all within the areas of the sea which it has proscribed, even in the defense of rights which no modern publicist has ever before questioned their right to defend. The intimation is conveyed that the armed guards which we have placed on our merchant ships will be treated as beyond the pale of law and subject to be dealt with as pirates would be. Armed neutrality is ineffectual enough at best. In such circumstances, and in the face of such pretenses, it is worse than ineffectual. It is not likely only to produce what it was meant to prevent, it is practically certain to draw us into the war without either the rights or the effectiveness of belligerents. There is one choice we cannot make, we are incapable of making. We will not choose the path of submission and suffer the most sacred rights of our nation and our people to be ignored or violated. The wrongs against which we now array ourselves are no common wrongs. They cut to the very roots of human life. We're going to keep going. With a profound sense of the solemn and even tragical character of the step I am taking, and of the grave responsibilities which it involves, but in unhesitating obedience to what I deem my constitutional duty, I advise that the Congress declare the recent course of the Imperial German government to be in fact nothing less than war against the government and people of the United States. That it formally accept the status of belligerent, which has thus been thrust upon us. When he says belligerent, basically that just means enemy. If you're belligerent, that means you're like not cooperating. So when he says the status of belligerent, which has thus been thrust upon us, he's saying like Germany didn't give us a choice. And that it takes immediate steps not only to put the country in a more thorough state of defense, but also to exert all its power and employ all its resources to bring the government of the German Empire to terms and end the war. What this will involve is clear. It will involve the utmost practicable cooperation and counsel and actions with the governments now at war with Germany, and, as incident to that, the extension to those governments of the most liberal financial credit in order that our resources may so far as possible be added to theirs. It will involve the organization and mobilization of all the material resources of the country to supply the materials of war and serve the incidental needs of the nation in the most abundant and yet the most economical and efficient way possible. It will involve the immediate full equipment of the Navy in all respects, but particularly in supplying it with the best means of dealing with the enemy's submarines. It will involve the immediate addition to the U.S. Armed Forces of the United States already provided for by law, in case of war, at least 500,000 men who should, in my opinion, be chosen upon the principle of universal liability of service, and also the authorization of subsequent additional increments of equal force so soon as they may be needed and can be handled in training. When he says that's a mouthful, and also the authorization of subsequent additional increments of equal force, he's basically saying also, I want to be authorized to do other stuff I might need to do. As long as we can train our soldiers to do it, we need to train them to do whatever. It will involve also, of course, the granting of adequate credits to the government, sustained, I hope, so far as they can equitably be sustained by the present generation by well conceived taxation. I say sustained so far as may be equitable by taxation because it seems to me that it would be most unwise to base the credits which will now be necessary entirely on money borrowed. It is our duty, I most respectfully urge, to protect our people so far as we may against the very serious hardships and evils which would likely which would be likely to arise out of the inflation which would be produced by vast loans. In other words, he's saying we don't want to have to seek out loans that we'll eventually have to repay because that's going to blow up inflation. So he's respectfully telling the people like, you'll be helping to pay for this with taxes. In carrying out the measure by which these things are to be accomplished, we should keep constantly in mind the wisdom of interfering as little as possible in our own preparation and in the equipment of our own military forces with the duty. For it will be a very practical duty of supplying the nations already at war with Germany with the materials which they can obtain only from us or by our assistance. They're in the field, and we should help them in every way to be effective there. I shall take the liberty of suggesting, through the several executive departments of the government, for the consideration of your committees, measures for the accomplishment of the several objects I have mentioned. I hope that it will be your pleasure to deal with them as having been framed after very careful thought by the branch of government upon which the responsibility of conducting the war and safeguarding the nation will most directly call. What does that mean when he says, I hope that it will be your pleasure to deal with them as having been framed after a very careful thought by the branch of government upon which the responsibility of conducting the war and safeguarding the nation will most directly fall? He's saying more or less like, I hope you'll agree to deal with this because I've thought a lot about it, and ultimately, this responsibility is on me, chief executive. Um, while we do these things, these deeply momentous things, let us be very clear and make very clear to all the world what our motives and objects are. My own thought has not been driven from its habitual and normal course by the unhappy events of the last 2 months, and I do not believe that the thought of the nation has been altered or clouded by them. I have exactly the same things in my mind now that I had in my mind when I addressed the Senate on the 22nd of January last, the same that I had in mind when I addressed the Congress on the 3rd February and on the 26th of February. Our object now, as then, is to vindicate the principles of peace and justice in the life of the world as against selfish and autocratic powers, and to set up amongst the really free and self governed peoples of the world such a concert of purpose and of action as will henceforth ensure the observance of those principles. That's another doozy. Our object now Our object now is to vindicate the principles. To vindicate means usually when that's used in non-political terms, to if you feel vindicated, that means you feel like you've sort of been your behavior has been justified, or um, in this case, he's basically saying like we gotta protect these principles. Neutrality is no longer feasible or desirable where the peace of the world is involved and the freedom of its peoples, and the menace to that peace and freedoms lies in the existence of autocratic governments backed by organized force which is controlled wholly by their will, not by the will of their people. We have seen the last of neutrality in such circumstances. We're at the beginning of an age in which it will be insisted that the same standards of conduct and of responsibility for wrong done shall be observed among nations, and their governments that are observed among the individual citizens of civilized states. Hang in there, guys. We're almost done. We have no quarrel with the German people. We have no feeling towards them but one of sympathy and friendship. It was not upon their impulse that the government acted in entering this war. It was not with their previous knowledge or approval. It was a war determined upon as wars used to be determined upon in the old unhappy days, when peoples were nowhere consulted by their rulers and wars were provoked and waged in the interest of dynasties or of little groups of ambitious men who were accustomed to use their fellow men as pawns and tools. So he's saying basically, we're not angry at the entire country. This is old school. These are guys who are doing stuff just in the interest of their dynasty, or they're using their people, and they're using their people as pawns and tools, just using them to accomplish their own dynastic goals. Self governed nations do not fill their neighbor states with spies or set the course of intrigue to bring about some critical posture of affairs which will give them an opportunity to strike and make conquest. Such designs can be successfully worked out only under cover and where no one has the right to ask questions. Cunningly contrived plans of deception or aggression, carried, it may be, from generation to generation, can be worked out and kept from the light only within the privacy of courts or behind the carefully guarded confidences of a narrow and privileged class. They are happily impossible where public opinion commands and insists upon full information concerning all the nation's affairs. A steadfast concert for peace can never be maintained except by a partnership of democratic nations. No autocratic government could be trusted to keep faith within it or observe its covenants. It must be a league of honor, a partnership of opinion. Intrigue would eat its vitals away. The plottings of inner circles, who could plan what they would and render account to no one, would be a corruption seated at its very heart. Only free peonies. Is that a typo? Let's look that up, guys. Yeah, so apparently a peony is a flower. So I'm going to say this is supposed to say only free peoples can hold their purpose and their honor steady to a common end and prefer the interest of mankind to any narrow interest of their own. Does not every American feel that assurance has been added to our hope for the future peace of the world by the wonderful and heartening things that have been happening within the last few weeks in Russia? Russia was known by those who knew it best to have been always, in fact, democratic at heart. In all the vital habits of her thought, in all the intimate relationships of her people that spoke their natural instinct, their habitual attitude towards life. The autocracy that crowned the summit of her political structure, long as it had stood and terrible as it was, the reality of its power was not in fact Russian in origin, character, or purpose. And now it has been shaken off, and the great, generous Russian people have been added in all their naive majesty and might to the forces that are fighting for freedom in the world, for justice and for peace. Here is a fit partner for a League of Honor. The funny thing is, shortly after the war, I mean, we're basically we've spent about the last century in some kind of uh, conflict, or really, we haven't been on great terms with Russia in a long, long time. So it's interesting to hear a president speaking so highly of the country. Um, One of the things that has served to convince us that the Prussian autocracy was not and could never be our friend, is that from the very outset of the present war, it has filled our unsuspecting communities and even our offices of government with spies and set criminal intrigues everywhere afoot against our national unity of counsel, our peace within and without, our industries and our commerce. Indeed, it is now evident that its spies were here even before the war began, and it is unhappily not a matter of conjecture, but a fact proved in our courts of justice that the intrigues which have more than once come perilously near to disturbing the peace and dislocating the industries of the country have been carried on at the instigation, with the support, and even under the personal direction of official agents of the imperial government accredited to the government of the United States. Even in checking these things and trying to extirpate them, we have sought to put the most generous interpretation possible upon them, because we knew that their source lay not in any hostile feelings or purpose of the German people towards us, who were, no doubt, as ignorant of them as we ourselves were, but only in the selfish designs of a government that that did what it pleased and told its people nothing. But they have played their part in serving to convince us at last that the government entertains no real friendship for us and means to act against our peace and security at its convenience, that it means to stir up enemies against us at our very doors. The intercepted note to the German minister at Mexico City is eloquent evidence. You guys all know they're talking about the Zimmerman telegram. We're accepting this challenge of hostile purpose because we know that in such a government following such methods, we can never have a friend, and that in the presence of its organized power, always lying in wait to accomplish we know not what purpose, there can be no assured security for democratic governments of the world. We are now about to accept gauge of battle with this natural foe to liberty, and shall, if necessary, spend the whole force of the nation to check and nullify its pretensions and its power. We are glad now that we see the facts with no veil of false pretense about them, to fight thus for the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of its peoples, the German peoples included, for the rights of nations great and small, and the privilege of men everywhere to choose their way of life and of obedience. The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of its political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and the freedom of nations can make them. Just because we fight without rancor and without selfish object, seeking nothing for ourselves but what we shall wish to share with all free peoples, we shall, I feel confident, conduct our operations as belligerents without passion and ourselves observe with proud, with proud punctilio the principles of right and of fair play we profess to be fighting for. I have said nothing of the governments allied with the imperial government of Germany because they have not made a war upon us or challenged us to defend our right and our honor. The Austro Hungarian government has, indeed, avowed its unqualified endorsement and acceptance of the reckless and lawless submarine warfare adopted now without disguise by the Imperial German government, and it has therefore not been possible for this government to receive Count Tarnowski, the ambassador recently accredited to this government by the Imperial and Royal government of Austria Hungary. In other words, he's saying Austria Hungary might not be Germany, but they've told Germany, by all means, go for it. We love it. They've co signed it. So he's saying we're not going to have an Austro Hungarian ambassador in our country when Austria Hungary is essentially, if not doing what Germany's doing, they're a part of the team. They're teammates. That government is not actually engaged in warfare against citizens of the United States on the seas, and I take the liberty, for the present at least, of postponing a discussion of our relations with the authorities at Vienna. We enter this war only where we are clearly forced into it because there are no other means of defending our rights. It will be all the easier for us to conduct ourselves as belligerents in a high spirit of right and fairness because we act without animus, not in enmity towards the people or with a desire to bring any injury or disadvantage upon them, but only in armed opposition to an irresponsible government which has thrown aside all considerations of humanity and of the right and is running amok. We are, let me say, again, the sincere friends of the German people and shall desire nothing so much as the early reestablishment of intimate relations of mutual advantage between us. However hard it may be for them, for the time being, to believe that this is spoken from our hearts. We have borne with their present government through all these bitter months because of that friendship, exercising a patience and forbearance which would otherwise have been impossible. We shall happily still have an opportunity to prove that our friendship and our daily attitude and actions towards the millions of men and women of German birth and native sympathy who live amongst us and share our life. And we shall be proud to prove it towards all who are in fact loyal to their neighbors and to the government in the hour of test. He's saying, we've got German immigrants and people with German ancestry in the United States, so let's be kind to them. Let's respect that they're Americans. They are, most of them, as true and loyal Americans as if they had never known any other fealty or allegiance. They will be prompt to stand with us in rebuking and restraining the few who may be of a different mind and purpose. If there should be a disloyalty, it will be dealt with a firm hand of stern repression. But if it lifts its head at all, it will lift it only here and there, and without countenance except from a lawless and malignant few. It is a distressing and oppressive duty, gentlemen of Congress, which I have performed in thus addressing you. There are, it may be, many months of fiery trial and sacrifice ahead of us. It is a fearful thing to let this great peaceful people into war, the most terrible and disastrous of all wars, civilization itself seeming to be in the balance. But the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to the authority to have their voice in their own governments, for the rights and liberties of small nations, for a universal dominion of rights by such concert of free peoples as shall bring peace and safety to all nations, and make the world itself at last free. To such a task, we can dedicate our eves and our fortunes, everything that we are and everything that we have, with the pride of those who know that the day has come when America is privileged to spend her blood and her might for her principles that gave her birth and happiness and the peace which she has treasured. God helping her, she can do no other. That was long, not going to lie, but I'm glad that we could go through it together. Um, if you got tired of listening to me, you can just pause it and flip through the slides yourself. But a little bit over our 30 minutes. So you guys take it easy. Great job. I'll talk to you on Monday.